So I hope everybody has still a little bit of energy for our last panel today. It was a hard marathon without the coffee break. I'm happy that the room is still full and so many people are still interested, even without coffee, in our topic. Short introduction of the new panel, which is the session, the application-orientated session. To my left, we have Mihai Alisi. He's founder of Akasha and founder of Bitcoin Magazine and co-founder of Ethereum. Akasha is a new type of social network based on blockchain technology, and his vision is a free and really decentralized internet. In the middle we have Demelza Hayes. She's researching at the University of Liechtenstein about the role of cryptocurrency in asset management, and I think she's one of the persons who has a Bitcoin wallet. So we can maybe ask a question again from the last panel. And on the right side, from your point of view, is Dexter Hadley from University of California. He has a medical background. He's working with AI and cancer imaging, and he has big hopes as well on blockchain technology for helping to manage the data, the private cancer imaging data he needs for AI uses. As I asked the other panelists at the starting round, what is the use case you are most excited about? I think maybe the answer is clear, but so I would like to add to that question, what is the use case you are most excited, and why is that use case really, why is blockchain really a perfect solution for your use case? Let's start with Dexter.
Sure, thanks. Clearly, I think health has the most, at least in my world, to benefit from a distributed, decentralized sort of system. In America, probably more so than in Europe, where you have more socialized health systems. And a capitalist health system is very easy for bad players to take control of patients' data, which is just incredibly wrong on a number of levels, but from a scientific perspective, it stifles innovation. So whereas I see in business, AI is sort of making a big deal in search and advertising all over the place. So in medicine, by law, that is sort of not the case, because technologies like distributed ledgers, they don't exist yet, sort of, or they haven't existed yet. So I see blockchain, sort of distributed ledgers, this idea of democratized data as the main benefit to healthcare.
Demelza, what's your favorite use case or application?
Great. Okay. Well, definitely, I think the open source aspect of public blockchains basically allows each cryptocurrency to be its own experiment in monetary policy. So for the past 800 years or so, we've had tons of centralized currencies, and basically two professors from the US, Reinhardt and Rogoff, did a data analysis of these currencies that have existed. And in almost every case, it ended in hyperinflation or default, or partial inflation, where basically the purchasing power of the currency was debased over time. So this means that the average people in society lost their savings. And I think that with cryptocurrencies, we can see right away that the cryptocurrencies that had inflationary mechanisms did not gain networks of people who used them. So for example, you had a Freicoin, which was a coin that started in Germany early on. It did not gain a very strong network because it had demurrage embedded in the protocol, where basically the currency just lost its value over time. And I think that what's going to happen over time is not that, going back to Mohan's point, it's not that people want to get rid of our current existing system. It's simply that we want to add competition to it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to allow this technology to experiment with other models that might not be the current models. And what that's going to do is, if those models have some beneficial features, the current system can adapt. And overall, I think we're going to have a higher quality in currency and in stock markets and several other financial applications.
Mihai, you're...
Hey, does this work?
Yeah.
So I'm going to echo some of the points made by Silvio on the previous panel. As in, self-governance is a big one, especially if you think at this setup where for the first time in human history we have over half a planet connected, interconnected, although we have these intermediaries in the middle that can easily manipulate the masses. And we saw, in the early days, the gentle push to buy a product and then a gentle push to vote left or right and so on, right? So it's a big part of our society and how it can influence our future. And the identity, and when you put the two, as in self-sovereignty, owning your identity, your data. And when you combine these two, there is like this, utopia in a sense. But at the same time, it feels that for the first time we have the right pieces of the puzzle to enable us to experiment towards finding what works and what doesn't. And if you look at the bigger picture, for the first time in human history, we are able to test and iterate super fast many parallel governance, identity, and economic systems that will or might become very relevant in the near future. Who knows? But if you look at the current economic system and how everything is hinging on, is this year going to crash or is it the next? It's not a matter of when things will go bad. It's rather a matter of when. And having an alternative and an option to the current system doesn't seem like a bad thing. On the contrary. It's in our own interest as a society to have an alternative in case things go bad. And you had a clear example with Cyprus and other economies where people, which they thought they had their money and so on, were effectively cut from their wealth. You had revolutions and everything. So that's, for example, an application where I'm excited about, as in offering people the alternative when the moment or occasion arises. And hopefully, when that moment happens, we will be able to transcend that in a more peaceful fashion than in the past, where it was always revolution, blood in the street, and so on. In this case, hopefully, by having something there that could slide into the daily flow of the people, that might offer a better way forward.
Maybe tell us a little bit more about your idea around Akasha and why it maybe helps to decentralize the internet as well, or why is the internet centralized at all? Wasn't that the idea of the internet, to be decentralized, and what went wrong?
Well, it depends on who you ask, I suppose. But ultimately with Akasha in this odyssey of discovery, so to say, in the past few years we started from like how can we make a blockchain application work, and we realized that there is this, again, complementary technology. So when you say blockchain, it's not necessarily just that. It's like you're having horse glasses and looking at just one piece of the puzzle. You also have, for example, the interplanetary file system, which can be combined. So, one of the previous panelists highlighted how the interplanetary, well, actually people were storing messages on the Bitcoin blockchain, which is like super expensive and very inefficient. So in this context, you can merge the two and come up with all sorts of applications. And in our case, it was a social network, right? And in this context where you have like self-sovereign identities and like this data spiraling around the user and user being in control of it and choosing with whom I want to share this data, you have like this emergent social network between the identities, which are those interactions that in some cases require trust, in some cases require some kind of trusted node connecting the two entities. And that's also where I think something that is exciting is especially this room and the work done by these bright minds when it comes to mathematics and computer science. In some cases, we are looking at decades-old mathematics, like, for example, the elliptic curve cryptography, which is at the heart of many blockchain projects. And in this context of blockchain, you have the opportunity of actually applying some of these hidden gems lost in the footnote in history or on some Wikipedia page. And actually people, without even understanding, when they send that Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency from one side to another, they're making use of public private key And it's, I think, as Sylvia was saying, a matter of iterating and exploring what can be done with this. It's almost like we are in the early 90s of the web. We kind of see the black text on the white background. That's like the digital money. And we cannot really imagine what can be done with this moving forward. And just like we had with the web, we had a continuous process of iteration and exploration in which, okay, we had the dot-com bubble. Yes, we had also the bust. But after that, we do have things that are completely changing the way we interact with each other. You have social networks, you have real-time video communication, you have all sorts of things that maybe would not have been possible without that failure. It's a trial and error, right? So with Akasha, what we're trying to do is basically an experiment-driven project in which we are trying to figure out how to make things work using this technology by putting in the first place the human, as in not being the product, and tap into and explore these alternative business models that otherwise, you know, just the default internet standard is surveillance capitalism, as in monetizing your data and so on. But in this paradigm, you also have the open, let's say, question of what can you do if you have these untapped resources around. So like if we take IPFS again as an example, we have these petabytes, like huge amount of data available in smartphones, laptops, and so on, that in theory people could monetize by sharing it with the network. So in that case, you know, you already have a flow of wealth and redistribution in the society that even someone in Africa, you know, has on the a second-hand phone, which is like, if it's an S2 or S4, as in an Android phone, it's already quad-core, might have a few tens of gigabytes. So I think where this is going is that people and entrepreneurs should be excited about this to try and explore additional business models, alternative business models, and also for scientists and this community to overlap with the, let's say, the more non-conventional blockchain crowd, because it is, in a way, a very interesting overlap and like an application of some of the core ideas that were invented years ago, decades. And by this overlap, hopefully we can turn some of those ideas in years into actually meaningful applications rather than, you know, decades.
That sounds like it has many parallels to Dexter's idea or project with distributing health data or especially images which can help AI to classify cancer. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how that works with blockchain technology.
Yeah, definitely. So whereas you're trying to put, or Akasha is trying to put personal information and, you know, baby pictures or whatever that you're free to put anywhere you want. Most people put on Facebook now. I mean, the idea would be put it on a decentralized storage platform. In medicine, you're not. In medicine, this idea of who owns your medical data? Well, I don't. I can't change my medical record. But I'm a custodian of my medical data, right? I can decide to give it to you and not to you. So there are a lot of parallels. IPFS, I want to put gigabyte files of data on IPFS. I don't know how much baby pictures are or whatever you would put on the social media. But so technologically, it's very similar. The architecture is probably exactly the same. But the application is very different, and the need. There's a whole privacy law that has shut down innovation in medicine in America, and there's no way around it. I think blockchain, distributed ledgers, and even more so, I think as physicians, I mean, can anybody name one killer app out of Apple's 1 billion, you know, apps for health? There's none. I mean, I feel like as physicians today, we have totally failed our digital patients. Why would they give us anything? So I mean, my idea is kind of similar, very, very similar to yours. I want to, at least, here's the mammogram you paid for, you might as well see it. It's yours. And if you can see it, then you can share it with me. I mean, the law says this can all go through today. It just doesn't because of bad actors and bad players. So it's very similar. I totally agree. And probably the same motives. Own your data.
So your idea is that patients can somehow keep their data or own their data and sell it to researchers or to Google or to
how many people in this room have had some scan done in medicine? Ultrasound, MRI, CAT scan. How many have seen it? None of you. A few of you. The really hardcore ones. But the idea would be, well, you paid for that. Why haven't you seen it? Right? You pay for all kinds of stuff. You see it. In medicine, there's, you know, you just, what happens to it? It disappears and somebody else profits from it. And that doesn't seem right. It just doesn't seem right.
So, something maybe connected to this is also the idea of how Bitcoin beyond, you know, like the digital currency, you also have this concept where you have this big pot of money and some incentives that makes people move towards that thing, right? And the results almost a decade later from this simple idea with the algorithm distributing that unit, which, you know, subjectively has some value, depending on who you ask, has led to this like equivalent of a supercomputer generated by these people that were basically just trying to get some of that, which is like more powerful than the top 500 supercomputers combined. And it's not a super nation state, it's not one single entity that was able to generate that, it was a bunch of people. So like an idea here is that if we can use the same type of thinking to create the incentives and the right incentives to actually better humanity, right? So instead of just breaking SHA-256, maybe in this scenario, if there is some kind of incentive where people, if they put their CAT scan and there is some value kind of, you know, pot of money, some of that value to be distributed towards researchers that would actually make use of that data and then feeding back into the whole system.
So to sort of tie into what you do, there's different values on the data, right? So a true positive exam where, okay, they say you have cancer, well, they say you don't have cancer and you really don't have cancer. There's a lot of those, right? But if somebody said you have cancer and you don't have cancer, I mean, there's a lot of consequence to that and pain and suffering, and that data should be valued more. It's going to improve the model that's currently representative of radiologist knowledge. And the other as well, if you're a patient who does not have cancer that somebody claimed that you had cancer, those kinds of data are inherently more valuable than the true positive and true negative value. Who's going to value how much that data costs? It's sort of like a stock or a bond. How it performs is what its value is. And to me, a distributed trustless system is how we can value it. And then have an exchange where this is open. It's private, yes. I guess I'm in the open blockchain camp here. But they can be an active marketplace. I work with at least 3 or 4 companies that want access to my data set. And the way it works is you pay me money, I get to do whatever questions and answer whatever questions you have and give you the results, but I can never give you the data, right? If there was a mechanism to patients to directly be vendors of their own data, that would solve a lot of problems. And they're hard numbers. There's 40 million mammograms run a year. I just want 5 of them, just 5 million, just total. That's totally doable. But not by any one healthcare institution. That's not possible.
Just one short question for understanding. Do they have more value, these false negatives and false positives, because AI can learn more out of them or can get more precise?
Yeah, if you're learning what you already know, it's not as valuable as learning the wrong predictions, right? So, yes. Luckily for me, there's a lot of wrong predictions in breast cancer. But there are different levels. The woman who lost her breast because of a false reading that she didn't need to lose is probably the highest category. She should be paid the most for her mammogram versus somebody who had a true negative reading, right? So there's different values, and I'm not technical enough to pretend to understand how it works, but I think of it like a stock. There's different performance and different data points, and they should be valued based on what people are willing to pay for them.
Something else maybe to add, you know, since we're moving towards the future, maybe not so distant, it's like when you have these nodes connected, like in a network effect, be it the people that actually contributed the images, the researchers that might actually use the fund to do the research, and maybe you also have this concept of crowdfunding, you know, which is like really easy in this paradigm because every identity is also a wallet. You can have bottom-up built laboratories and maybe even hospitals in the long term. So that token or that can also represent a membership that can benefit the...
Well, here's the problem. I work for a federal institution. And I am terrified to have an ICO, even though I have a legitimate cause.
Yeah.
It's not, who knows if it's legal or not? I mean, I should probably talk to you after, but it's a thin line. Like, you don't want to, sell your reputation by just having another ICO in a big pot of shady ICOs.
I'm not necessarily advocating to have an ICO, but I'm trying to explore how the right incentives and in an ecosystem can create the interesting feedback loops that can actually the people that participate in get at the other end better off, right? In terms of health, in this case, not necessarily as in gains monetary.
Yeah.
So.
Last question before I open to questions from the auditorium. Demeter, we had this more or less philosophical discussion about value. I heard this argument quite often in the last days from people here that cryptocurrencies don't have a real value. What is your comment on that?
Okay, well, it depends on how you understand value, but in 1871 there was the Principles of Economics written by Carl Menger. He basically wrote that value is subjective, so the way that you value an orange is going to be different than the way I value an orange, and actually it's the fact that we have different values of that orange that is the basis for why we trade the orange. So if we valued the orange equally, no trade would occur. Okay, so basically with cryptocurrencies, it's basically a subjective value, and you can determine that value for yourself. And anyone that says it has no value, well, that's clearly empirically not true. So empirically, it has value. And if it's going to have long-term value, that's very difficult to forecast. But I think in general, the concept of having currency that is global and permissionless, I think it's hard to argue that that concept doesn't have value. Yeah.
In your talk, you made an interesting point that there was no correlations between stocks and cryptocurrencies. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why that happens, and what's your interpretation of that?
Sure. I mean, if you do, one thing I didn't mention in my presentation is that if you do time frame analysis, so if you change the dates that you pull data from, you can see that the correlation is increasing. So the first couple of years, the correlation basically didn't exist. But if you just take the last year of data, or if you just take the past couple months of data, the correlation is slightly increasing over time. And I think right now it's increasing over time because there's actually more institutional investors that are joining the cryptocurrency market, and they're basically speculating on cryptocurrencies the same way they would speculate on the stock market. However, I think that originally it was basically uncorrelated because it has a different governance model. So let's say stocks and everything, stocks and bonds, they basically exist within a regulated financial market, and they have central clearinghouses that clear transactions, and they have insurance companies and different intermediaries that reduce counterparty risk, and it's a very different governance model. With cryptocurrencies, basically, there's nobody backing it, and there's also no centralized system of clearing, and so basically you just have a different set of risks. And so I think that originally the correlations were different because of the different governance. I mean, one aspect of cryptocurrencies that makes it extremely unique as a financial asset class is that it cannot be confiscated. So stocks. I mean, if you look at the DTCC in the United States, this is a central clearinghouse, and every single year they get sued by companies for allowing naked shorts, which is basically where the settlement time takes more than an instant. So with atomic swaps on a blockchain network, you can do instant settlement. But with the DTCC, it's a centralized clearinghouse, and you have stocks where the investor will go and buy all of his stocks off of the stock market, and then the next day, his stock is still trading. And you ask, how is that possible? How is it possible? Well, it's because of the way the settlement works. It's a T+3 settlement date. So you have 3 days to give back the stocks that you shorted. And sometimes these shorters don't actually give back their stocks, which is when it becomes a naked short. So these centralized clearinghouses have been attacked for losing stocks for years. And basically what it actually is it's fractional reserve holdings of stocks. So it's just, it's the same way that the banks work with fractional reserves. It's the same concept. And of course, these brokerages earn money for lending out stocks. Okay, so I think that definitely cryptocurrencies offer a very unique return and risk profile compared to other asset classes, and that's why it's uncorrelated.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Please go.
just since we're on this point of the correlation between crypto and equities, is there a correlation between fiat currency and equity and stocks? We're both uncorrelated, just currency as a whole is just not correlated with.
It's very low correlation. It's very low correlation. In one paper, peer-reviewed paper done about a year ago, they showed that there was some positive correlation between Bitcoin and emerging market fiat currencies.
Okay.
So I think that could be because a lot of the trading going on, a lot of the volume for Bitcoin is actually done in emerging markets.
So I think we have at least 3 questions from the audience. Just start.
Yeah, hi, so Tobias Meyer, I run the HLF Twitter channel, and I have a question to the Melza and the others too. It just picks up on what you just said. When an ICO, so initial coin offering by a company occurs, essentially you treat this currency as an equity. Same would be, say, a company issues stock. So with having stock comes certain rights for an owner. So that's sort of the first part of the question. And the other part is, so if a cryptocurrency in form of an ICO is treated as a stock, how does that relate to cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, which are treated like currencies, like money that you can deal with? So can you elaborate a little bit on the differences of those use cases of cryptocurrencies?
Sure. Okay, where to begin? Well, I was at a Chatham House meeting at Wharton about 2 weeks ago, and this was one of the main discussions that came up. And basically, currently, the investors in ICOs do not have clear rights. I mean, basically, the white paper can claim, so the white paper that they release is kind of like a prospectus. It's not a prospectus, but it's some kind of document that gives investors an idea of what they're investing in. That doesn't actually give rights to the investors, and I think it's a very tricky situation because if the ICO cheats you, and you go to the court and say, look, that startup company cheated me, well, the court systems say, well, why didn't you invest within our existing regulated financial system? So you want to skip all the cost of our existing regulated financial system, but then you still want all the benefits, right? So I think that would be a very hard argument to make, and I don't see why the courts would actually need to enforce the claims that are the rights of the investors in this situation. However, I think that the way that the U.S. is going, I mean, the U.S. is basically going in a direction where they want every white paper to announce basically what a prospectus announces. Okay, and they're going to have basically, they've all come up with different models, but there's one model where they basically have you come to a sponsored agent who is registered with the SEC. That sponsored agent is going to look at your white paper, make sure that it has all the requirements, and then basically announce that you can actually launch your ICO. But if you don't get that sponsored agent and the prospectus approved, you're basically committing financial crimes. And then as far as the way different tokens are treated, in the US, you have all these different financial market authorities. So you have the SEC saying this is a security. You have the Commodities Futures Trading Commission saying this is a commodity. You have, the Federal Reserve saying this is a payment system. So you have basically different ways to look at this technology, and I think that, again, this goes back to subjective value. How do you value it? How do you use it? Many people use it for multiple use cases, and I think that it's very hard to fit into any kind of existing regulatory environment because it fits so many different policies. And I think the one final point to make on your question is that despite the extreme volatility, the well-known cases of fraud, people still prefer using it. So what does this say about our current system? What does this say about our current financial system?
Can I add something to?
Short, please, yes.
Sure, I'll try to keep it short. So even the word ICO, it's like a hangover from IPO, right? And if you look at it, stakeholder is like shareholder, again, a hangover. And we humans, in the longer term, seem to have like this tendency of copying the previous iteration of what it was. And a very good example would be the automobile. So the early prototypes, let's say, of the automobile did not have a steering wheel. They had a tiller, right? Which was borrowed from what we had previously as boats. So I feel to some extent we are doing kind of the same thing, trying to borrow what worked in the previous iteration. And on the note, like in the presentation, I mentioned briefly the conversational DAOs, which should, in theory, kind of alleviate, in a sense, this disconnect between the stakeholders and the actual, foundation or whoever is actually developing the protocol. Because currently there's a complete disconnect between the two. Once you gave them the money, you sign on that, I agree that you have no rights, this is actually not a share, all the stuff that you actually read when you find out that you were scammed. But a system that would enable continuous feedback between the participants and the actual developer of the protocols should at least bring that shareholder, ability to steer the course of the project, which should alleviate also the problem of this complete disconnect between shares and tokens. So I think we're still very early, we're still learning, and this is us breaking eggs to make an omelet.
Did you want to make a comment? No. Can I just say one last thing on that? There was a really nice paper written last year, Coin-Operated Capitalism, by a professor at University of Pennsylvania by the last name of Hoffman. It's an excellent paper. What he does is he took 50 ICOs from last year. He had 100 doctoral students in computer technology in the computing program look at the smart contracts of those ICOs. And he found that there was a very small amount of the smart contracts that actually coded what the white paper said the coin did. Okay, but the thing is that nobody actually reads the smart contracts before they invest. And he basically showed that these smart contracts can be completely modified. So the amount of coins can be modified, the amount of committees that make validations can be modified. The whole entire system can be modified, and that's built into the code. So I definitely think that it's something to consider prior to investing, is actually understanding what you're investing in.
It can be modified.
Sorry, but we have 2 more questions. It's interesting. Yeah. I appreciate that, but we have 2 questions, and we are again over time. Dinner is waiting. Is that okay that we skip the discussion here and let the next questions be asked?
So I'll ask a question about value, but in a different sense. Many applications and consequences of distributed ledgers on society are controversial, and that's beyond the scope of a scientist, of an engineer to solve. So do you, or did you, work with an ethicist? How do you solve these problems?
I think that's maybe something for Dexter.
I do not talk to the administration about blockchain technology at all. No, I did not work with an ethicist. Well, that's not true. So we work with an institutional review board, which is the ethical board to conduct any kind of research. In my case, there's very little risk, even if we put your mammograms out in public. It's very hard to identify somebody from a mammogram with no identifying information. So there's very little risk in what I'm doing. Once you get into ultrasounds, the patient's name is on the ultrasound, there's ethical concerns of privacy. But one of the reasons I picked digital mammography, 1, because I know there's 40 million of them floating around America at any one year, and 2, it's completely anonymous. So this can go on IPFS with very little ethical issues.
What I wonder is if the first thing you think, if you think about health data and blockchain, this is immutable and is stored forever, is that a problem in any case?
So any IRB is going to mandate, even for genetics and genomics work, anonymized data is put into the public space, and people work in the anonymized space. I don't think blockchain is any different. I guess you can, the way, to me, it works is, at least for medical data, there is a steward of the data. For instance, I'm a steward of all these mammograms I'm going to collect. And if you don't want to be in my study, I'll just stop sharing your, I will just stop being a steward for your data. To points that were raised last night at dinner and throughout the day today, if you already have a key to that data on IPFS, if you already have the address, well, that's it.
Then you have everything, right? Or
then you have everything. But
yeah.
prospect, in the future, I just don't give out that address if somebody does not want to be in the study anymore. And of course, they agree to informed consent. All of this is explained, and they have to agree before I would accept your data. So, in the clean world of academia, I think there are ways to still leverage this technology in spite of the shortcomings. And it's no different to a regular database, to Mohan's point when he made it before.
Short reaction to that?
Regarding ethical implications, it makes you wonder, for example, Facebook and these companies that have the ability to influence in mass people, and they conducted actually experiments trying to see if they can make users either feel more happy or sadder depending on the content displayed on the feed. So there are tons of examples like these that make you question the ethical behavior of that company. And I think the open source and the transparency of blockchain in some regards can put in place a system that makes it hard for people that want to exploit or do something unethical to be seen by others. Similar to how you have the open source, and if someone tries to plant a backdoor, you just count on the number of eyes to find that backdoor, right? So in a similar sense, if you have something similar to Facebook, where the algorithm that actually decides what appears on your feed is a subscription to an address, and you're just pulling the data from the blockchain where it is, you are at least in control of seeing the information flow. And when it comes to if we interacted with ethicists, we are constantly, have this soul searching into what we are doing. Is this going to end up like some Black Mirror thing? Or is this actually going to be improving humanity? So I think this kind of question and deep questioning is something everyone should do in this field, because it's something that potentially could influence on scale, right, in the current interconnected setup. But what I like to sum it up, open source and transparency, I think could provide a solution to the lack of ethical standards, because people could point to what's going on. Currently, you cannot. It's a black box.
I mean, currently in medicine, privacy trumps ethics. The way data flows today is not ethical at all. Nobody would agree that we have an ethical system for data management.
Yeah.
Right.
We have a private one.
So, last short question and short answer.
So actually, I find the idea of an open, transparent system very appealing, but I was just wondering whether the discussion could include perhaps there being a spectrum of central versus decentralization when it comes to use cases. So do you envisage an ecosystem where all of that is possible and each one essentially answers a particular use case?
So I think that's spot on, and in the future there is this gap between fully decentralized, I don't know, 10 years further down the road, who knows, maybe earlier, maybe later, and there will be this gap to bridge, which in terms of user experience, when you have a completely decentralized system, getting that information or that experience up to you just click and it loads, it's hard. So I think there will be an incremental use of just the required and where is the maximum impact, strong authentication, verifiability, traceability, where these things trust, where this thing can be fit in a let's say, more centralized system. And gradually, as the infrastructure matures and we have public, blockchains being able to scale and the cost of transactions lower and so on, maybe in time we can, move to a fully decentralized setup. But I think in the near future, the hybrid will be probably the approach that will win.
I think it depends on the application. I mean, by the nature of medicine, it's a private enterprise. Patients, doctors, and developers are really the only people in my network that need to see this data. Very different for a social network, very different for a financial network. So it totally depends on the application and sort of the context, I think.
But for example, if someone would visit the website to upload that picture, if they would have to spend 10 seconds while the thing is rooted, they would probably end up not using it, right? So we have this example with PGP, which was great, you know, but people didn't use it because it was not user-friendly, right? Even today, it's hard to set it up. So I think we also have to think on how to make it usable so people actually use it, right?
Sure.
So I think everyone has to gain and to be practical, very use it, because it's not there yet to be used in everything, right?
Yeah.
Make it easy. I think that's a good point to wrap up with.
Thank you.
And I think this is what's coming. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for staying with us all the time without coffee. Thank you.